What the hell you want, boy? Damn!
Art 101 with Mr. Burgher.
Well, hello again, friends. Welcome back to yet another episode of Art 101 with me, Mr. Burgher, a professional artist, master educator, attempting to bring you the best in art historical content. If you like this one, please make sure you interact with the video. Much appreciation to the likes, the thumbs ups, the subscribes, the comments, and all of the rest. Thank you.
What is your problem?
Now, February is Black History Month. And, one of my absolute favorite African-American artists is an artist by the name of Jacob Lawrence. I have done a video on him in the past. There's a link down below if you're interested in that. But today, what I want to talk about is a specific series that he created back in 1940-41 called the Migration series, sometimes called the Migration of the Negro series. And this is a absolutely powerful set of 60 works that was created by Jacob Lawrence, and I really want to share that with you today. The Migration series, originally titled The Migration of the Negro, is a group of collective works intended to work together to tell a story by the renowned artist Jacob Lawrence that was painted between 1940 and 1941. You might be asking yourself, what is the story? In a nutshell, it's basically the story of African Americans traveling from southern states to northern states in the 1910s and continuing until the 1970s. Poor economic conditions, Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, and discrimination was the catalyst that really inspired this move. During World War I, there was a great migration north by Southern African Americans. At that time, the major destinations were Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. As represented here, large droves of people were heading to these major urban centers. The war had caused a labor shortage in northern industry. Citizens of foreign countries were returning to their native lands. Beginning all the way back during the Great Depression, the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, was created to help citizens that were suffering through the Great Depression. This work was created under that umbrella to help keep artists like Jacob Lawrence working during this time of economic strain. Here we see a machine operator working in a quarry. Lawrence is addressing the shortage of northern industry due to the impacts of World War I. From every southern town, migrants left by the hundreds to travel north. In this panel, clearly, Mr. Lawrence is using the parallel between the migrating birds and these migrating individuals toward the north. All other sources having been exhausted, the migrants were the last resource. Again, we're looking at migration that occurs right at World War I. So basically, all of the able-bodied white men were fighting in this war, leaving minorities to the work here in the United States. And this depiction of the man with the hammer illustrates that work that was done by African Americans and other minority groups. Migrants were advanced passage on the railroads, paid for by northern industry. Northern industry was to be repaid by the migrants out of their future wages. Jacob Lawrence is using this train as a symbol of the various means that African Americans used to travel from the south to the north. The trains were crowded with migrants. I think it's interesting to point out that in this panel, like all of the 60 panels, Jacob Lawrence is using rhythm consistently in each panel. He's got the same yellows, blues, greens, reds, browns, textures, shapes, values, all being used to help tell this story in a unified and consistent way. The migrants, whose life had been rural and nurtured by the earth, was now moving to urban life dependent on industrial machinery. Some left because of the promise of work in the north. Others left because their farms had been devastated by floods. Flooding was happening because of a lack of levees and the infrastructure that was needed to hold these waters back. In 1927, for example, a destructive flood placed 27,000 square miles of farmland under 30 feet of water. This would influence the entire Mississippi River Valley, including Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Tennessee, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. They left because the boll weevil had ravaged the cotton crop. With cotton being a major cash crop in the South, hundreds of thousands of workers were put out of work because of this infestation, and so for many, traveling north was their best option. They were very poor. Food had doubled in price because of the war. Here we see a mother cutting fatback for her family and malnourished child. Fatback is the top layer of backstrap that has a very thick, hard layer of fat on it that was often subsidized to people of a lower or more poor socioeconomic structure, especially back in these days. And in the modern day South, it is such an ingrained part of their culture that this is a much desired food that many people enjoy.
I want to eat some of them chitlins. I love pig feet.
The railroad stations were at times so crowded with people leaving that special guards had to be called in to keep order. The crops were left to dry and rot. There was no one to tend them. For African Americans, there was no justice in Southern courts. There are innumerable examples of unfair arrest, persecution, and sentencing of African American men, predominantly by Southern courts. Many of these cases had made the news from the mid-1900s on to the 1970s, and perhaps it could be argued to this day. But nonetheless, this bias faced by so many Southern blacks that they felt the only recourse was to try to find equality and justice in the northern states. There were lynchings. And after the lynching, the migration quickened. Tenant farmers received harsh treatment at the hands of the planters. In other words, the white planters could do all kinds of unethical business practices toward the black farmhands without a lot of recourse from the black side because there was no system in place that had the back of the black worker. The migration gained in momentum. There had always been discrimination. In this panel, Mr. Lawrence illustrates the white side and black side. They're separated by the road. But look very closely. What is the difference between the white woman and the black woman? Nothing. They have the same hat, they have the same coat, they have the same look. They are the same other than the color of their skin if they would only let the road get out of the way. In many of the communities, the black press was read with great interest. It encouraged the movement.
It's different to read a book than it is to listen to a book.
Right.
Families arrived at the station very early. They did not wish to miss their trains north. Migrants left. They did not feel safe. It was not wise to be found on the streets late at night. They were arrested at the slightest provocation. The migration spread. And here again we see a great example of the lines, shapes, colors, and textures that are being rhythmically placed into these panels. Their children were forced to work in the fields. They could not go to school. They left their homes. Soon some communities were left almost empty. And people all over the South continued to discuss this great movement. Many men stayed behind until they could take their families north with them. Mr. Lawrence, in discussing this particular panel, had said that there is so much division in the African American community. This begins all the way back from their times in Africa, where families are separated. And here there is a depiction of this separation. the family over here, the man at the bus terminal buying tickets over there. As much as they could, they would try to stay together, but inevitably there was always this division that occurred. The labor agent set south by Northern Industry was a familiar presence in the black communities. Again, we're talking about the time just before and after World War I. During World War I, there's a huge job shortage where labor agents were going south to try to find able-bodied black men to come to the Northern Industry to keep things running. And they very much were exploiting the fact that they needed work. A situation that seemed very mutually beneficial, but over time would also create some rifts between black and white communities. The labor agents recruited unsuspecting laborers as strikebreakers for Northern Industries. So in effect, if there was a conflict between the able-bodied white workers that were in a factory or someplace like that, that company would hire black workers to come in and take those jobs so they could drive their wages down and keep that factory running without having to deal with paying the white workers what they thought they should be paid. Obviously, this creates a problem between the communities. In every southern home, people met to decide whether or not to go north. The migrants found improved housing when they arrived north. The railroad stations in the south were crowded with northbound travelers. Letters from relatives in the north told of the better life there. The black press urged the people to leave the south. They left the south in great numbers. They arrived in the north in great numbers. Migrants arrived in Chicago, the gateway to the west.
You see, if you don't make calls, you don't make any sales.
This man does not represent me, Your Honor.
I would remove that from the court records. I would.
Many migrants found work in the steel industry. They also worked on the railroads. Railroad platforms were piled high with luggage. The migrants arrived in great numbers. The South was desperate to keep its cheap labor. Northern labor agents were jailed or forced to operate in secrecy. In two previous panels, he refers to labor agents and the work that they did to fill jobs that were emptied from World War I. Now he's looking at the backlash of that after the migration hits its peak. To make it difficult for migrants to leave, they were arrested en masse. They often missed their trains. In a few sections of the South, leaders of both black and white communities met to discuss ways of making the South a good place to live. But the living conditions were better in the North. Here we see two major staples of black Southern cuisine, the dried cured ham hanging from a nail and the loaf of bread. Salt pork was used with collard greens. The fat was rendered for lard, which was used for frying and baking. The skin was used for ham hock and whatnot. Every part of a pig was used from the snout to the tail within the African American culture at this time. And this has also become a major part of Southern cultural food that is very much a present day thing. The migrants arrived in Pittsburgh, one of the great industrial centers of the North. Industries boarded their workers in unhealthy quarters. Labor camps were numerous. We see the steep ascending staircase that is meant to symbolize the fact that you can move up but you can't get out. There is the barricade of the black door keeping you in your place. And this goes back to the idea that progress for a race is a long, slow progression.
Who do you think I am, huh?
As the migrant population grew, good housing became scarce. Workers were forced to live in overcrowded and dilapidated tenement houses. Housing was a serious problem. They found discrimination in the North. It was a different kind. Race riots were numerous. White workers were hostile towards the migrants who had been hired to break strikes. African Americans seeking to find better housing attempted to move into new areas. This resulted in the bombing of their new homes. One of the most violent riots occurred in East St. Louis. This was a situation in East St. Louis, Illinois, where migrant African Americans were coming into the community to fill jobs at industrial plants. The tensions were rising between the blacks and the whites, whose unions were very upset by the fact that these people were coming to fill their jobs and working for lower wages. The result will be widespread riots, bombings, and horrible violence that left hundreds of people dead and thousands of blacks that were leaving for fear of their well-being. African Americans, longtime residents of northern cities, met the migrants with aloofness and disdain. Perhaps it's natural for the haves and the have-nots to have a divide, and that was no different during this migration. There were those that didn't have a need to help those that were struggling, and perhaps in that way, some things just don't change.
Man, I can't believe that, you know what I'm saying?
For the migrants, the church was the center of life. The migrants, having moved suddenly into a crowded and unhealthy environment, soon contracted tuberculosis. The death rate rose. The African American professionals were forced to follow their clients in order to make a living. The female workers were the last to arrive north. In the north, the African Americans had more educational opportunities. The series of numbers symbolizing progress was not the end-all be-all because discrimination was happening all over the place, but it seemed like they were having more opportunities for education than they had in their past. In the North, they had the freedom to vote. And the migrants kept coming. That's heavy, but man, I love that story. Thanks for watching.
There is no me in you. Not no more.